Hello, and welcome to this discussion of 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. Before we begin, please note that I've included a link to the transcript in the video description below, which includes a bibliography and supporting material. Also, when I pronounce ancient Koine Greek in this video, I'll be using the modern Greek pronunciation system, which is how many native Greek speakers pronounce ancient Greek. With this in mind, let's begin. Around 1993 years ago, within the 1st century Greco-Roman world, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified in his mid-30s by the Romans under the orders of Pontius Pilate, the 5th Roman prefect or governor of Judea. This historical event was referenced by various writers within the Greco-Roman world of that time, including Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus, Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, and a possible reference within a letter of Stoic philosopher Mara bar Serapion. But the earliest source material recording this event is found within 1st century writings including the Gospel accounts of Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, and other writings later compiled into the collection of books known today as the New Testament of the Bible. Not only are these sources the earliest writings we have about Jesus to date, all written while people who knew Jesus could have still been alive, but they also provide corroborative evidence supporting the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. The collective information we've come to learn through archaeological discoveries from the time and geographical setting of Jesus demonstrates that the resurrection hypothesis, i.e. the claim that Jesus rose from the dead, is indeed the best supported explanation of the interrelated geopolitical, religious, and sociological context, and entire Sitzumleben, or setting in life, leading up to and following his crucifixion. Of all sources that reference Jesus' death, some of the earliest dated information regarding this event according to modern textual critical and historiographical scholarship can be found within a famous passage from the Apostle Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth. In chapter 15 of this letter, a letter dated by many scholars to around the mid-50s CE, Paul states the following: "Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preached, and so you believed." Notice how Paul mentions here in verse 3 that this gospel he had communicated to the Corinthians, which was as of first importance, was a message that he had also received. In the first couple chapters of his letter to the Galatians, Paul writes that he met with the other apostles in Jerusalem and likely confirmed his understanding of the gospel with them to make sure his message was accurate and consistent. Paul's mention of this gospel being a message which he himself had also received points to the reality that these statements regarding Jesus dying for our sins, being buried, resurrecting, and appearing to people post-resurrection had already been circulating well before Paul referenced it in this letter. The early dating of this material and the significance of this text in explaining the foundation and origin of Christianity is widely agreed upon within biblical New Testament scholarship, from skeptics to Christians alike. In other words, this is one of the oldest records of what the earliest Christians believed about Jesus and the gospel message that they risked their lives to spread. The important details and implications of Jesus' life, teachings, death, and resurrection are indeed recorded in depth throughout the rest of the first century documents, especially in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. But the core of that gospel, the good news that Jesus died for our sins, that he was buried, and that people claimed to have seen him risen from the dead, is all in this passage. Paul then goes on to clarify that many of those who claimed to have seen the risen Jesus are still alive. In other words, those who read this letter could have even interviewed witnesses if they wanted to further investigate these claims. Finally, before going into further explanation in the remainder of the chapter regarding the meaning and significance of Jesus' physical, bodily resurrection, Paul inserts himself into these traditions as the last of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, he says, because of his ruthless persecution of Christians before his radical conversion. With all this in mind, let's read these verses 3 through 7 in the original Greek. Paradokagari minen protis oke parelevon. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. Oti Christos apethenen ipertona martion imon katatas graphas. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. Ke oti etafi ke oti yigerte ti mera ti triti katatas graphas. That he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. Keoti oftiki phaitatis dodeka. And that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Eepitao oftiepano pentecosis adelphis ephapax. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. Exoni pliones menusin neos ardi, dineste ekimithisan, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Eepita ophthiekovo itatis apostolis pasin. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. As we already mentioned, the creedal and appearance traditions Paul includes here are widely understood within biblical New Testament scholarship by Christians and skeptics to trace back to a very early date when Christianity first emerged. Textual critics and historians have been able to reasonably date the information contained within this text, especially the contents of verses 3 through 5, to somewhere between 30 to 35 CE, which would have been just within a couple years after the possible date range of Jesus' crucifixion. If we're looking for a record of what the earliest Christians believed about Jesus and the gospel message that they were willing to risk their lives to spread, this is a good example. Let's read through 16 short excerpts of recent New Testament scholarship relating to the early dating of the pre-Pauline traditions included in this passage. Keep in mind that these scholars come from a wide range of beliefs and backgrounds, and the first 6 of them are not Christians. Moreover, and this is the important part, Paul indicates that he did not devise this statement himself, but that he received it from others. Paul uses this kind of language elsewhere in 1 Corinthians, see 11:22 through 25, and it is believed far and wide among New Testament specialists that Paul is indicating that this is a tradition already widespread in the Christian church, handed over to him by Christian teachers, possibly even the earlier apostles themselves. All the pieces of tradition here, death, burial, resurrection, appearances, came into being at a very early date. We can assume that all the events reported in them are to be dated to the first couple of years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Because of the extraordinary nature of each of these events, we may reckon that appearances of Jesus were talked about immediately after they happened. The evidence for the first basis, the appearances, is very early. It goes back at least to what Paul was taught when he was converted, a couple of years after the crucifixion. The most likely source and time for his reception of that tradition would have been Jerusalem in the early 30s when, according to Galatians 1:18, he went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, or Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. On the assumption that Jesus died about 30 CE, the time for development was thus 2 or 3 years at most. In fact, the evidence for this creed dating to the very origin of the religion is amply strong, and there is no reasonable basis for claiming otherwise. In 1 Corinthians 15:5-8, St. Paul has a list of people to whom Jesus appeared. It's a very, very early list, much earlier than the Gospels, dating from only a few years after Jesus' death. This tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as tradition within months of Jesus' death. This chapter is of exceptional importance for historical inquiry, both because it is earlier than the Gospels, from the mid-50s CE, the earliest Gospel mark is not much earlier than 70, and because it has embedded within it a creed which may date from as early as the 30s. For the aforementioned reasons, virtually all critical scholars who have written on the subject, including rather skeptical ones, maintain that in 1 Corinthians 15:3-7, Paul has provided traditions about Jesus that he did not form, but rather received from others, as he claims. There is likewise widespread agreement that it was composed very early, and may very well be the oldest extant tradition pertaining to the resurrection of Jesus. It was probably formulated within the first 2 or 3 years after Easter itself, since it was already in formulaic form when Paul received it. We are here in touch with the earliest Christian tradition, with something that was being said 2 decades or more before Paul wrote this letter. Therefore, we see that a number of eyewitnesses were either preaching or available for questioning concerning their experiencing of various appearances of the risen Jesus. This testimony did not take place only years later, but immediately after the original manifestations. This formula is widely accepted as quite old, probably reaching back to within the first 5 years after Jesus' death, and its origin is usually looked for in the Jerusalem church where Paul might have got acquainted with it. The early pre-Pauline formulas of faith, reaching back probably to the 30s of the 1st century, already interpret the crucifixion as some sort of atoning sacrifice for sins. Examples 1 Corinthians 15:3-5, Romans 3:24-26, Romans 4:25, and later on this approach is developed at great length in the Epistle to the Hebrews. Paul himself stresses the paradox of God putting to shame a proud and powerful world of sinners by the shameful death of a weak Jesus on the cross. See 1 Corinthians 1:18-31. There can be no doubt that in his own recital of a charismatic summary in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is citing the eyewitness testimony of those who were recipients of resurrection appearances, including the most prominent in the Jerusalem church, Peter, or Cephas, the 12, and James, the brother of Jesus. There are more of these early dated formulaic and creedal traditions about Jesus as well, sprinkled throughout the writings of other New Testament letters. But for the sake of time, for the purposes of this discussion, we'll have to reserve the discussion of those for a later time. Now that we've discussed the general context of this passage and the undeniable early dating of some of these fully codified traditions to within a couple years, if not months, of Jesus' crucifixion, let's turn our attention to some of the oldest extant manuscripts containing this passage. Thanks to modern technology, we can view these manuscripts digitized online. This is the P123 Oxyrhynchus 4844 papyrus manuscript. There's not much to see with this one, as it's only a fragment, so we won't take much time with it. But this side contains portions of verses 3-6. It's written in Greek, dates to the 4th century, and is located in the Sackler Library of Oxford, England. Next up is the P46 Chester Beatty II manuscript, which is also written in Greek on papyrus. It dates to the late 2nd century or early 3rd century, and the pages containing this passage are located in the Chester Beatty Library of Dublin, Ireland. This page contains chapter 1434 through 15:5. Let's take a closer look at verses 3-5 of chapter 15 here. Paradoka, gar, imin, en, protis, o, ke, paralevon, oti, Christos, apethenen, hyper, ton, amar, and then the rest of the word, dion, imon, kata, tas, grafas, ke, and then oti is ripped off, etafi, ke, oti, aierte, and then t is ripped off, as well as the first portion of imera, so this is the ra, ti, triti, kata, das, and then grafas as well as ke oti are all ripped off. But then we have ofthi, gifa, ita, and then dis do the ka is also ripped off. Here is the next page containing verses 6 through 15. Let's take a closer look at verses 6 through 7 here. So the first part of verse 6 is actually missing here. So it's picking up in the middle of the verse, and we have menusin, eos, arti, dines, de, and then the next word spills over into the next line too. So we have ekimithisan, epita, ofti, iekovo, ita, dis, apostolis, basin. Here is this passage within the Codex Vaticanus. For the sake of time, we'll just show this one and the next one instead of reading through it as we did with P46. But suffice it to say, the message remains unchanged between these manuscripts. As the name suggests, this Greek manuscript is located in the Vatican, and it dates to around the mid-4th century. Finally, here is this passage within the Codex Sinaiticus. Also written in Greek, this is the oldest surviving manuscript containing the entire Bible, both the Greek translation of the Old Testament and the New Testament. It is likewise dated to the 4th century, but possibly later than the Codex Vaticanus. Most of the manuscript, i.e. most of its folios or pages, can be found today in the British Library. Now that we've seen this passage in a few extant manuscripts, here's a summary slide of all of them. The contents of this passage would have been memorized, rehearsed, and circulated by the earliest Christians. It is likewise fitting for followers of the risen Jesus today to memorize it too, since its historicity and meaning is the foundation of the entire Christian faith. Since songs have been shown to be one of the most effective methods of memorization, I put this passage in the original Greek to a melody, but you can also create your own. Paredoka karimin en protis oke parelevon oti Christos apethanen hyper ton amartion imon katatas grafas ke oti etafi ke oti eirte ti meriti triti katatas grafas ke oti ofti kifa ita tisto deka epita ofti epano pentecosis adelphis ephapax exoni pliones menusineos arti teneste ekimithisan epita ofti iekovo itatis apostolis pasin